All right. So we're live. Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. Today we're going to talk about organizing the world internationally. And we have some people, at least one person here now, who knows a thing or two about international, transnational organizations and scholarship dealing with international affairs. And this is Phyllis Bennis. Hello, Phyllis.
Hey, Metta, good to be with you.
And here comes John Pfeffer. I was a little bit worried that John wasn't going to make it. Let's see, John, can you get your microphone going now? Try it. Uh-oh, I'm not hearing you. Well, John's having technical problems, but maybe we will, he's going to work on it. And in the meantime, I've got Phyllis all to myself, which is quite a treat. All these years, I've heard of Phyllis Bennis. In fact, I've heard you give speeches occasionally. I've been in the audience and you've given talks. I think you gave a talk probably about Israel, if I'm not mistaken.
Probably, I do that a lot.
You do that a lot. Well, this is a good thing for us to get started with, because I'm sure that you must have thoughts about what's going on in Israel nowadays. I haven't turned on my TV today to see whether Netanyahu is really out or just on we're hoping. What do you think's going on there? And is he going to be really sunk, or has he already been sunk? And are you hopeful? And tell me who these guys are who are going to take over in his place.
Well, I think that what we're seeing in Israel right now has actually a lot to do with global mobilizations. It has a lot to do with Palestine. What is not going on is the possibility or likelihood of any real change in Israeli policy towards Palestinian rights. The possible replacement of Netanyahu with this so-called change coalition may or may not happen. Netanyahu right now has a week to essentially undermine the coalition or do something else, and he's known for ruthless creativity, maybe is the right term, for figuring out ways to stay in power. Right now, that's
survivor.
He's the ultimate survivor, and right now it's personally urgent because he faces the very likely possibility of going to prison once he is no longer the prime minister. So the urgency from his vantage point is even stronger than usual, and that could mean, all he has to do is find one person in one of these 8 very disparate parties that he can bribe or threaten or whatever to pull them out of the coalition. He also could try again what may have been going on in the war in Gaza last month, where clearly one aspect of it was to promote this notion that he has promoted for so many years, that he is all that stands between Israel and its potential enemies, and therefore he must be supported. The possibility didn't play out the way he expected. He didn't get a lot of additional support, but that doesn't mean he's not going to try again. I think people should really be keeping an eye on the borders of his foreign policy regions, which means maybe Gaza, maybe Lebanon, certainly Iran. Those options for him are not as out of the question as one would hope. So
what would he do?
He would try and provoke Iran, for instance. They've done that before. They could do it again. Iran just lost a major ship that was sunk in the Strait of Hormuz 2 days ago. If Israel tried to do something like that, hoping that Iran would strike back, Netanyahu looks strong. He looks like he's what supports the people of Israel. There's a lot of possibilities and none of them are very good. The one other thing I would say, and I see John is with us now, hopefully with voice, so we'll bring him in.
Let's test John. So let's see if you can speak, John Pfeffer.
I can speak.
There you go.
Hey, there you go. Okay, you're kind of a silhouette. It would be nice to see your face, but better voice than even a silhouette.
I can take this somewhere else.
All right, that's fine. You're looking good. Or you're looking better. Anyway, you're looking.
There you go.
That's terrific. I'm glad you're with us. And you know what? I want to tell you some news, John. We may be joined, I hope, after a little bit by Kai Brand Jacobson, who is in Spain at the moment. And this morning he sent me a notice that if I really still want him, and of course it would be nice, he would change his flight back to Romania so he can join us, but he'll be a little late. So we will have who knows what's going to kind of a conversation we're going to have today, but it's a wonderful opportunity if he does it for me to introduce the three of you. So because you all ought to know each other. It's really good. Okay, I want to go back to Phyllis, who's explaining the facts of life about life in Israel and the Middle East. And
Well, this is really more about life for the Palestinians than life in Israel. And the bad news is, if this happens, if there is a new coalition, it could lead to Netanyahu going to jail, which in my view would be a very good thing. I would rather that he be going to jail after being charged in The Hague with war crimes rather than this sort of economic corruption set of charges, but I'd settle. The problem is that
let me introduce you and ask whether that is at all in the cards. Is there any real effort to bring him to, does a prosecutor, for example?
The prosecutor in The Hague is investigating Israeli as well as potential Palestinian war crimes from the 2014 Israeli assault on Gaza.
But not now, this recent one.
No, not yet. There is a decision by the Human Rights Council to open an investigation and send a special investigator. That will help. But so far, there's nothing in the Hague on this one. But I think what's important for people to keep in mind is that if this does happen, whatever happens to Netanyahu, frankly, is of less concern than what it's going to mean for Palestinians. And the unfortunate part is it's really not going to mean very much. Mm-hmm. The person who will take over as the first prime minister for at least the first 2 years, assuming this weird coalition actually can stick together, Naftali Bennett, is significantly further to the right than Netanyahu.
How could you be further than that guy?
It's the political reality inside Israel has moved so far to the right that in the current cabinet, Netanyahu is one of the most left forces within it.
My word.
Because it's a coalition of the right, the far right, the extreme right, and now the fascist right, because Netanyahu has invited in the Jewish Power group to participate. So we're looking at a situation where the conditions for Palestinians are not going to change. The new, if he becomes the new prime minister, Bennett has said explicitly there will be no Palestinian state, and he supports the annexation of wide swaths of territory across the West Bank. He was one of the great supporters of the new law that was passed in Israel in 2018 that says explicitly that inside Israel, inside the 67 borders, where 20% of the citizens are Palestinians, that only Jews have the right of self-determination, only Jews. So it's making explicit the apartheid policies that have been in place for many, many years, but where it's not quite acknowledged. There's this claim that, well, they're citizens, they can vote like everybody else. Therefore, we have equality, when they actually have, complete inequality, because not all rights go to all citizens, So that's kind of what we're looking at. It's a very weird situation where I think an awful lot of people would be delighted to see Netanyahu gone. But what comes after, it's not going to make things any better.
Okay, what I don't understand is why people like us aren't winning things in Israel. My impression is that people like you are ascendant in the US, and I don't know about Europe, but that public opinion is definitely changing and is much less pro-Israeli than it was, say, 5 years ago, or maybe 6 months ago, I don't know.
Both.
But if that's happening in the US, why isn't it happening in Israel? What is—
The opposite is happening. There has been a massive shift to the right over the last several years. And the really depressing part about it is that the polls seem to indicate that the furthest right-wing, racist, anti-Arab, Islamophobic, the worst of it, is among the youngest Israelis. And it goes directly up. The least racist are the oldest cohort. Mm-hmm. And that's a very bad development. It's a very bad development.
Yeah. All right. Well, that is, part of what keeps me up night, you know.
As it should. It's a dangerous reality.
It's not that I focus on Israel. I'm very poorly informed about Israel or Palestine. But what I look at the world from, you know, outer space, and I think, what's the matter with these folks? The whole damn place is going to rack and ruin. And I have a very pessimistic view of things. But I'm not going to lay that on you. I want to hear what you folks have to say about the state of the world. And now that John has joined us, maybe we can broaden the conversation or focus it somewhat differently and ask you two people to tell me about the Institute for Policy Studies, because for years I've been going around saying, I'm tooting a horn for you folks. I keep telling the world that the Institute for Policy Studies is the best liberal think tank in the world. And I don't know a damn thing about you. I don't know what you do. I don't know who you are. I just make this up as I go along, but I kind of think you belong in this planet.
We appreciate that.
Tell me what you do and who you are and how it works.
John, you go first.
Well, we appreciate, of course, you know, your touting of the IPS around the world. That warms our hearts. You know, we think of ourselves as the connection between social movements and policymaking circles, progressive policymaking circles, to the extent that they exist in Washington, D.C. And we have done so since 1963. We have worked with social movements like the civil rights movement, the women's movement, LGBT movement. And today we work with organizations like the Poor People's Campaign, all of which is to kind of elevate and to amplify the concerns and the demands of folks, not only in the United States, but worldwide, for progressive values, progressive principles, economic justice, civil rights, human rights. And we have scored, you know, many victories over the last 50 years. But of course, you know, as Phyllis has said, you know, the movement to the right in Israel has unfortunately been mirrored, although perhaps not as extremely, by movement here in the United States and elsewhere to the right. I mean, we've seen a shift to this extent that IPS, you know, where we may have been kind of, I would say, in the center of things, you know, politically back in the 1960s and 1970s, we have remained true to our values and our principles, but unfortunately the political spectrum has shifted. So we perhaps are not as kind of central as we were, say, in the 1960s or 70s. But I think we are still effective on an issue by issue basis.
Okay, now you have, just organizationally, you have several sort of departments or sectors. I think Phyllis is the head of something called the
New Internationalism Project. We have 10 separate projects.
Okay, is John part of your bailiwick? Are you his boss?
Oh, no. No, we don't have bosses exactly. I mean, we do have project directors, but John has his own project. He's not part of my project, although we often collaborate. We often work together.
Tell me about your project. I know John from Helsinki Citizens Assembly days, so we sort of, I know his values and his interests, and sort of his foreign policy and focus work. But I don't know much about your, do you call it a department? This new international project. All right, tell me about it.
The New Internationalism Project that was sort of created when I came to IPS in the mid to late 90s was partly about the Middle East. It was about Palestinian rights. It was about stopping wars and sanctions against Iraq at the time. Sanctions against Iraq was a very big issue in the 1990s. And then with the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the rise of what became known as the global war on terror, that's been a big focus of my work, trying to stop those wars, prevent further wars against Iran, that sort of thing, pushing for diplomacy over war. But at the same time, I was doing a lot of work around the question of the United Nations and the challenge of US domination of the United Nations and how that undermines the capacity of the UN to serve the purpose for which it was created, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war.
Wow, hold the phone. We've got a newcomer. Here we are with Kai Brand Jacobson. Hello, Kai.
Hi, Meta. I'm sorry I'm late. It's very nice to join.
Well, it is lovely of you. I hear you have changed your flight from Spain, going home to Romania, just so you can join us, which is such a wonderful thing, because my big idea was I wanted to introduce the three of you to each other, to know each other very well. Phyllis Bennis is here, and John Pfeffer, because they both are at the Institute for Policy Studies, and you at the Romanian Peace Research Institute, which I'm not quite sure I got the title quite right, but you are doing very international work. So I think everybody who is concerned about how we're going to put the progressive parts of the world back together again internationally should get on the same team and let's work together. So say hello to Phyllis and to John Pfeffer.
It is a pleasure. I have followed and appreciated your work for many years. So it's very nice to be able to be here with you.
It's nice to hear. Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I had just asked Phyllis to elaborate on the structure of the organization, the Institute for Policy Studies, and she has something called the New Internationalism Project, which she was telling me a little bit about. And of course, you know that John runs this online publication. Good, go on, Phyllis, and Phil, you guys feel free. I think I'm going to step back and let you guys get acquainted the way you would normally do if I invited you to lunch, okay?
Okay.
So interrupt each other, and if you agree or disagree, let's go at it.
Well, what we've tried to do, the New Internationalism Project, which now finally, after some years, has another person, Kari Peterson Smith, who has done amazing work. He was one of the co-founders of Black for Palestine, and he comes out of both Palestinian rights work and broader anti-war work around Iraq, around sanctions, around military bases in Asia, a whole set of things. So what we work on includes this question of US domination of the United Nations and trying to figure out ways to challenge that, ways to use the United Nations and push it to engage more with civil society. We're working on that right now around Palestinian rights. There's a conference coming up that the governments of South Africa and Namibia are coordinating next week, which is not officially a UN event, but it's kind of on the sidelines of some UN discussions about the issue of the responsibilities of the international community, meaning governments, to take seriously the need to challenge the rise of discrimination of all sorts on a global level, including the rise of apartheid. And in that context, looking at the question of Palestine and what the governments need to do. I mean, what we've been talking about, the possibility, for example, of trying to get the UN to call for a conference, a pledging conference, where the issue is not pledging money, but pledging actions, where governments would agree to take on certain specific actions, whether it would be to stop importing Israeli military equipment, stop selling arms to Israel, a variety of things, not allowing Israeli ships to dock at their ports, things that right now civil society and social movements around the world are doing. Just today, an Israeli ship tried to land in Oakland, California, and the longshore workers and a lot of Palestinian rights activists and others were there to greet it and say, "Oh no, you're not unloading this ship here. We've been down this road before a few years back. We managed to get away without having to have the ship unloaded. The ship sailed away fully loaded, and I think they're going to be able to do that again." Precisely because what you said earlier, Meta, is exactly right. Civil society around the world, public discourse on the question of Israel-Palestine is changing dramatically and quickly. And at some point, governments are going to have to somehow take that into account. It doesn't work automatically that you change public discourse and then the policy changes. Our democracies are not that good. But it also can't be ignored altogether. So that's sort of one of the areas of work. And then what that means in terms of how IPS functions, we do research and writing, and we do op-eds, we use the media, we on occasion meet with members of the Progressive Caucus of Congress, that sort of thing, if they ask for it, for a briefing. But mainly what we do is work with movements that are fighting on these issues. So that means for our project, we work with the anti-war movements, we work with the Palestinian rights movements, I work with Jewish Voice for Peace, Corrie works with Black for Palestine, but we also work across silos, across sectors. So we have one of our other projects that we work with a lot, the National Priorities Project, that works a lot on cutting the military budget. They're doing some really wonderful work with the best parts of the young climate justice movement to raise the issue of military spending with the climate justice folks. And so they start to make those links of how military spending, which right now is 53 cents out of every discretionary federal dollar.
You're talking about the US only.
I'm talking
right?
about the US, but we're also talking about the global part.
Okay.
Because the,
But here, I want to stop you because what bothers me, and I think you're very aware of this, is that the Green New Deal, which of course we all love, I do, it doesn't have anything about militarism.
and we tried to get it in there. We've met with people. We're still doing that. It will come. It's not there yet, but it will come in the context of military spending, because at the end of the day, you can't have a Green New Deal if you continue to spend 53 cents of every federal dollar on the military. You can't have Medicare for all, something that you have in Canada, something that I think even in Romania, which is a far poorer country than the United States, has guaranteed healthcare for everybody. We don't have that, as you all probably know. We're not going to be able to do that if we keep spending all this money on the military. So that's the link that people make. And globally, these movements are global as well. The Palestinian rights movement is enormous in much of Europe, all of South Africa, not so much in the Middle East, ironically enough, a bunch of Asian countries. So it's a very global movement. And we saw that around the war in Iraq as well, the global movements to prevent that war, the February 15th, 2003 mobilizations around the world that brought 15 or 16 million people into the streets on one day. So that's a lot what IPS does as well. We work with global movements as well as US.
That's wonderful. So, some of that I didn't even know, because your project on military spending, I suppose you must have some contact with the guys in the IPB who are working on this GDAMS, or Global Day of Action Against the Military Spending.
John helped create that mobilization. John, you should talk about that.
Yeah. Bring us up to date, John, on what you know about their current activities. I did a talk show about a month ago with two of the guys in Barcelona, because this is sort of winding down. It's about the time they do it for about a month now, work on trying to get people aware of the extent to which military spending is depleting all the other possibilities of funding.
Well, we started it because, well, obviously we saw the problem of the huge expenditures, not just in the United States, but globally on the military. But we saw an opportunity because the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute was issuing its statistics on global military expenditures in April, around the time that we were having our tax issues here in the United States, tax day, middle of April. And we saw this as a great opportunity to kind of ensure greater publicity for the SIPRI figures. As people know this year, as people probably know this year, the expenditures are about $2 trillion globally in terms of military spending. And they've been rising. I mean, there was obviously some modest dip near the end of the Obama administration, both for US military expenditures, but globally. But they've been steadily rising since then. So it started out as a day, but then it has increased to a month, and it involves civic movements all around the world. And it's a double message, that the military spending priorities, or the budget priorities in our country, are skewed, and they are skewed globally, and the two are related.
Mhm.
And there's no way we're going to be able to address environmental issues within our countries, much less the climate crisis globally, until we address these budget priorities. And I think Phyllis is right. You know, there was a challenge, and there has been a challenge in getting military issues and militarism into the discussion of the Green New Deal. And in part, that's because, well, to be frank, Green New Deals are largely abstract for the moment. I mean, here in the United States, they were put into a piece of legislation, but the legislation has no teeth. And the strategy right now is to kind of, well, break out pieces of it, possibly through infrastructure bill or a jobs bill or a social spending bill, but nothing under the rubric of Green New Deal. In part because there are people within the Democratic Party who are going to vote it down. The Democratic Party, obviously is not going to get much support from the Republicans on this issue. So this is the strategy, is to kind of subsume everything under other issues, and military simply has not come into the conversation yet.
Well, I
Well,
would say, let me just respond to one quick thing you said at the end, John. I do think that the broadly defined Green New Deal, which was put forward as a kind of resolution, as a statement of principles, as John said, more than specific legislative action, actually does play a very important role in shaping what an entirely new approach to dealing with climate and climate justice would look like. So it's not in any form going to pass anytime soon, but it's shaping the debate in a whole new way. And I think that part is really important, even though it's not, even on the isolated levels, not much is going to pass anytime soon. But it's given a form to this idea. In similar, John mentioned the Poor People's Campaign that we work with very closely, led by a couple of extraordinary ministers, Reverend William Barber and Reverend Liz Harris, who have put together what they call a fusion movement, very multiracial, gay and straight, rural and urban, just very, very broad, around the principles based on Martin Luther King's identification of the three evils of racism, poverty, and militarism, and added climate to that, climate devastation, and said, to deal with the problem of having 140 million poor people in this country, we have to deal with stopping systemic racism, stopping poverty, stopping environmental destruction, and stopping militarism. And that's given all of us kind of the framework for the kind of intersectional work that we need to do.
But we're not winning. I mean, the global military spending keeps increasing no matter what we do, which makes me aware of the fact that living here in Canada, there's one of the big debates within the peace movement is, should Canada get out of NATO? The reason is, if we stay in NATO, they say everybody in NATO has to start chipping in more money because the US carries the burden too much and you guys need to pay more. Well, and I don't know that we're paying a whole lot more, but at any rate, the impetus to leave NATO or to use our position within NATO to change NATO's policy vis-a-vis things like the tactical nuclear weapons in Europe and the other ways in which we could have an impact. All of that is attenuated by the general impression most people have here is we ought to be in NATO. Now, what I wonder is, Kai, you travel around Europe a lot, and I don't know what the situation in Romania is, whether your friends are all trying to get into NATO. And if so, what is the discourse there about military spending and about joining NATO and the economic and environmental implications of doing so?
Thanks, Meta. So I don't only travel all around Europe, but all over the world in many different contexts. And as you know, we only work anywhere when we are invited and working concretely on the ground in communities and countries affected by war, and working with people's movements all over the world, but also working with governments, the UN and others. And I want to connect with a number of the points that have been raised, but when you're asking about what is the discussion, what is impressive or important to recognize is broadly, there is not a discussion. There's a hegemony of the discourse and the narrative, at least amongst most academics and in the political spaces. There's very little discussion of intelligent or effective approaches to security. So there's the concept that we simply wholeheartedly step into the confrontational paradigm with Russia and more widely on a global scale. We need to be members of NATO. We need to install missile systems to increase our defense. You have increasing of confrontational missile systems across Europe at the moment, being placed by the United States with allies in Poland, in Romania, and elsewhere. And you have an increase on aggressive posturing on the Russian side as well. But it's extraordinary. I was at a Black Sea Regional Security Conference a few years ago, and it was like taking a flashback to the height of the Cold War in terms of the narratives and the paradigms. And these were the places where the generals, the politicians are invited. There's not the broader populace having a window into it, but it really is embedded in deep confrontational logic. Everything that is done on that side is bad. Everything that is done on our side is good when we're doing the exact same things. The problem is it's seen the same way from the other side. And when listening to the discussion, and Phyllis, you were mentioning intersectionality and the coming together of these different movements that are critiquing various systems of injustice or oppression, it was bringing me back to a book we were just discussing in the program now, where I've been working with participants from all over the world, coming from contexts deep in experiences of violence, from Cameroon to Nigeria, Colombia, many different contexts. And it's a book by Rebecca da Costa called The Watchman's Rattle. You might be familiar with it. And one of the things that she looks at is this question of how is it that what have been considered the greatest civilizations of their time, from the Khmer civilization, the Mayan, the Aztec, the Roman Empire, the French Empire, the Soviet Empire, the American Empire, how have they all collapsed? And you can fill bookshelves with academic works which try to provide explanations because of corruption in governance, constant wars on the frontiers, depletion of natural resources. There's many different, usually single causal theses that are put forward for why they say this or that empire civilization collapsed. And one of the points that Rebecca points out is, to varying extents, depending upon the situation, all these different factors are important. It might be some more in some cases than in others. But when we focus all the discussion on trying to understand why did they collapse, we sometimes forget to ask the equally important question: why didn't people solve it? Because in none of these cases were the crises and the systemic problems that they were facing things that they weren't aware of. But why is it that these societies, which were seen as the height of culture, science, organization, administration at their times, why were they unable to solve these problems? And when you speak to some of the challenges we're facing today, and you recognize, as you said, Meta, we have increasing militarism and militarization consistently over decades, especially on steroids since 2001 again. And we have the growing crises from climate destruction, growing authoritarianism in many parts of the world, growing inequalities and concentration of wealth and control of means of production, increasing surveillance and penetration of people's private and personal spaces by whether companies or governments, many others. We have many crises and problems that are growing. One of the best at a glance presentations of these is the global risk analysis that's done every year by the World Economic Forum, just looking at the weighting of all these different problems. And then you look on the other side, how are we addressing these challenges and risks that we're facing? What's our actual capacity to address them? And what I would suggest is the strategies and approaches that we're using today are actually escalating and worsening them, rather than helping us to solve them. Working in the area of peace building, when I'm hearing you ask, for example, with the Green New Deal and the linking that with anti-militarism or critiquing war budgets, and when Phyllis, you were speaking about the growth of transformative politics, trying to find approaches to solving these issues. One of the things that we work in the peace building field is looking at how do you actually find solutions to these crises and challenges. And I think one of our gaps is that broadly in the anti-war movement, there's no connection with actually peace building as a field. There's the emotional, there's the recognizing also politically the negative effects of war, but we need to get much better at making the distinction and the argument between simply bankrupt and failed military approaches to addressing conflicts and actually effective approaches. It's not a distinction between hard security and soft security. It's not a distinction between NATO and alternatives. It's that the military approach to addressing conflicts, whether it's in the recent conflict in Israel-Palestine or in many other contexts, it systemically and systematically fails to actually provide solution or be able to address the actual issues that the conflicts are about. And yet still it is dominant. It's dominant in military thinking. It's dominant in most universities. It's dominant in our budgets and expenditures, as you were saying. There are very few countries in the world that actually train people effectively in understanding how do you address conflicts? How do you do early warning systems and prevention? How do you deal with post-war stabilization and peace consolidation? How do we build the capabilities to address and solve these problems, these systemic challenges that we're facing? And I think we
Let me
need
just,
a lot more effort there.
Meta had said we should interrupt, so I'm just going to interrupt.
Please.
The question, because it seems to me, if we use the example of the current upsurge in violence in Palestine, this isn't a new conflict. This is one more round of a 73-year-old conflict. But I disagree with the notion that we don't have good alternatives. You're right that states are not training people to do all those things because states have an interest in maintaining military solutions to various things and maintaining military spending. They're linked to who puts money into political campaigns, the military corporations that manufacture the bombs and manufacture the bullets and the guns and the airplanes and the submarines and all those things. But it's also that this is a standard set of definitions of what conflict means and how you solve it. Talk to Palestinians. They're very clear that this so-called peace process that has failed for 25 years was going to be a failure. You know, I wrote it, thousands of people wrote critiques of it within weeks of the signing of the so-called Oslo Accord, saying this is never going to work. This is never going to work. And yet you see in the media who gets invited in. Well, so-and-so, whether it's Dennis Ross or Aaron David Miller, they're all famous because I worked in the peace process for 25 years. And I always want to say to them, yeah, and how'd that go for you? You know, what you got to say for yourself for that? You know, why are they still dealing with these people as if they know something? They were 25 years of failure. They should be treated as failures and shunted aside. But that's what political movements are all about. I think if you look at it from the vantage point of what governments are not doing, sure. But that's not the same as saying that we don't know what real alternatives are. We do know. People on the ground know. There's people that are building movements based on, for example, on Palestine, the movements are not talking about states, one state, two state, red state, blue state. It's not about states. It's about rights. It's about equality. That's how you manage these conflicts. Anything else is managing, not solving. And as long as we look to the governments to change that, I think we're going to fail too.
So I'm not looking at all to the governments, or rather I would say I'm not looking only at all to the governments. And I would agree with you completely. The first piece I wrote right after the Oslo Accords was quoting Tacitus saying they created a wasteland and they called it peace.
They called it peace, right?
Yeah. So when you're looking at the official state policies, what the Oslo Accords enabled was the waging of the conflict more effectively for the Israeli state to continue and to expand their conflict goals. What it did not do is to create the context and conditions, or it was not used to actually transform the underlying drivers and structures of the conflict. But one of the challenges, I've worked on the ground in Israel-Palestine over many years with many of these movements. We were involved with the popular committees in Nelin, Berlin, Nablus, and elsewhere on practically organizing resistance to the building of the wall and to much more. But when you look at the strategic effectiveness of our movements on the ground under incredibly difficult conditions, but we still need to do a lot more and
Absolutely.
a lot more.
Absolutely.
And it's extremely, and the interesting aspect is in the context of Israel-Palestine. Now, when I'm speaking about peace building, I'm not speaking about Dennis Ross or others and their trips there. And there is no peace process in Israel-Palestine. There hasn't been for a long time. I was there doing an analysis for the UN in 2019, and what comes out when you're meeting with the different actors on the ground is complete and utter strategic bankruptcy. There was absolutely no strategy or plan for how to address the conflict. Here I'm speaking about donors, governments, and more broadly. Now, amongst citizens movements, we can say that we have alternatives as a concept. We know what we would like. But in terms of being able to wage that struggle effectively, to broaden our alliances, to achieve change, to dismantle the architecture of the occupation and apartheid and build something better, there's a lot of challenges and gaps there. There's a lot more support that's needed. And yes, we're broadening the movement to a certain extent, but we're not yet at a space where we're catalyzing significant effort and pressure to really achieve a solution, like in South Africa and elsewhere. It's part of a definitely continuing struggle, I would suggest.
Yeah, I see it differently. I see it as moving exactly in that direction. It took the South African anti-apartheid movement 60 years to build the movement that we all saw when it emerged in the late 70s and through the 80s. They had been working for 55 years by that time. The Palestinians have not, and I'm hoping it doesn't take that long. But I think that the strategic work of civil society, the creation of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, the creation of the nonviolent movement against the wall, all of those reflect understanding what they can learn from global movements before them, including the movement in South Africa. But it's not easy. I mean, they're up against the strongest powers, economic, military, and strategic in the world. They're not up against the Israeli government alone.
Increasing transnational repression, like just when you were saying about the movements in Europe and solidarity, there are movements in solidarity, but one of the dynamics of the last years has been the state of Israel working with governments in Europe to criminalize any form of critique of what is done by the state of Israel under laws which see it as hate speech and anti-Semitism.
The same is going on here. It's actually further along here. So we're all dealing with that. But that's precisely because we're having victories. You know, the reason they're going after the students, things like there's something in the US called the Canary Mission. It's a silly name, but it's basically an effort by a lot of supporters of Israel to identify student activists while they're still in school, post on a website their name, their school, and what their area of interest is, in the hopes that in the future, a potential employer might go to this website, look them up, and find out that they were a student activist, and then won't hire them because they're a troublemaker. You know, the idea is to punish them for their activism. And there's a lot of versions of that. But the reason they're going after students, and they're not, for example, going after the mainstream churches, which are having a far greater impact economically through the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. There's been a lot of work within the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Unitarians, a whole host, the United Church of Christ, all the mainstream Protestant denominations have passed or are still struggling over resolutions to stop their retirement accounts, their retirement investment accounts, which run into the hundreds of millions of dollars nationally, to stop them from investing in corporations that are profiting from Israeli occupation and apartheid. And they're having real success, but they're not being targeted. And the reason is they've got the capacity to fight back. Students are vulnerable. Individual students are very vulnerable. So that's who they're attacking, because they can, and they can have a terrible impact. There's no question about it. But we have to see that in the context of we're having real victories in this movement. The shift in public discourse, the shift in the media has been extraordinary. And now we're seeing the beginnings of a shift at the policy level. You know, we're not there yet, for sure. But in this last month, you know, aside from the congressional champions who are really out there, you know, explicitly condemning Israeli apartheid and supporting Palestinian rights, you see things like the 12 Jewish members of the House of Representatives who sent a letter to Biden demanding a call for an immediate ceasefire when Biden was refusing to do so. You know, their letter wasn't the kind of letter I would write. It didn't have the language I would have appreciated, but that doesn't matter. The point was, these are people who have never taken up this issue, who suddenly did. 500 former campaign workers of the Biden-Harris campaign, wrote an open letter in incredible language condemning the Israeli assault on Gaza and demanding an end to US support for it. All of this is an indication of, that kind of change. A new young journalist who just started as an op-ed writer at the New York Times, one of his inaugural pieces, I think it was his second, maybe his third piece, he's just starting out. And he's out there talking about the need to change why Biden should be listening to the left wing of the party on the question of Israel-Palestine. And the sky didn't fall. This is what's so extraordinary, these small steps that we're seeing. So I think we are having an impact. Unfortunately, it doesn't show up yet on the ground. And that's the horror story.
Mhm. What I'm wondering is how to connect good guys, transnationally. One of the things a year or so ago, John was trying to do, you made a point that I hadn't recognized, John, and I guess you're still right, I don't know. You said that the progressive transnational movements, such as, you and I met at the Helsinki Citizens Assembly, but, the World Economic Forum and all these many other international movements have pretty much collapsed, but that the right-wing movement are going gangbusters. And I hadn't thought about it before, but you made an effort to bring some of us together to have a conversation about how we could, begin to reestablish contact among people. I wonder whether I would love to see whether you and Kai have similar ideas about that, because Kai is probably spends more time on an airplane than he does on the ground, moving around between countries and doing conflict resolution workshops and so on. But I don't know whether there's, yesterday I talked again with Andrei Kamenchikov, who runs something called GPAC. It stands for Global something, a Peace Action or something. And no, please don't. It's got to stay off.
Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict.
Yeah, right. So this is an umbrella organization, I gather, if it's an organization at all, it's a network anyway, of peace groups in Eastern Europe. And there's another one in the Caucasus, and there are places all over the place. So what prospect is there for beefing up something like that and hooking these things more together and having, for example, John and I both have the fantasy of a website that people could use as a meeting place for sharing ideas not only across different organizational entities, but across different global issues.
Well, I think, Meta, you've characterized that very well. And I think that, the World Social Forum for more than a decade represented perhaps the best hope we all had for transnational activism that cut across sectors, that cut across countries, cut across generations. And I think it achieved a great deal, although obviously it ran up against a number of challenges, not least of which the ones Phyllis has enumerated in terms of the well-heeled opposition, economic, military, et cetera, that we face as progressive forces. I think in recent years, the Social Forum, even before the pandemic hit, was focusing more on sectoral questions, mining issues, human rights issues, and so forth. And the pandemic has set us back a step, certainly in terms of the ability to meet in person, to organize in person, although obviously meeting on Zoom increased proportionally. But we're at a moment here where I think we're all questioning, well, what is the next step in terms of transnational activism? Not so much on a particular issue, and Phyllis has identified very clearly how there's been tremendous transnational activism around Israel-Palestine, and we've seen in the last year on Black Lives Matter, on Me Too issues, a tremendous actual increase in transnational activism. So the question isn't where is transnational activism? There's plenty of it. The question is, where is it going to be effective at an institutional level internationally that is multi-issue? And here again, I think, when Phyllis was talking about the Green New Deal and its capacity to serve as a framework, that is a hopeful step forward. I mean, if we think of the Green New Deal, a global Green New Deal, not simply as a way of addressing the question of carbon emissions, but really the question of how the global economy works and how we as international civil society interact with our representatives and ourselves, then it can very well serve as both a framework and an institutional way of engaging one another at a policy level, at an activism level, transnationally. So for me, at least over the next year, I'll be focusing on this question of the global Green New Deal and where it is from, country by country, area by area, and where at the multilateral level we will find purchase and traction for these ideas, not just specifically in terms of policy, but again, as a framework. So that's what I'm looking at right now. I don't know if Kai has a different perspective or Phyllis has a different perspective.
I have to step out in just a moment to head to the airport to make a flight, but I very much agree with what you're saying. I want to touch for a moment on what you began with, Meta, in terms of speaking about the transnational organization of right-wing movements and of extremism. This is an area that we are engaging with a lot in Europe, and I would say it is much more widespread than many people realize. We've seen a lot of incidents recently in Britain, in Germany, and elsewhere, where we're also seeing the penetration of police, intelligence, and armed forces by extremist right-wing movements, and this is increasing. I think during the pandemic, we had an event recently bringing together practitioners, academics, experts all across Europe, looking at the phenomena of everything around extremist movements. And one of the points that was raised is, it will be some years before we really realize and see the impact that this pandemic has had. Because we are having a continuing increase of fake news and murkiness of messages, conspiracy theories, loss of trust in many different sources of information. What people are being exposed to is very well orchestrated, well organized. You're getting these memes put out, these messages put out. It's well funded. For example, the role of the coalitions for the family across much of Central and Eastern Europe, which have been leading movements for referendum, trying to define marriage as only between a man and a woman. These are funded by the right wing of of American churches predominantly, which bring in speakers, organize conferences, organize seminars, trainings, tours of the US. And this is being done on a much more active scale than the other sides, the organizing of inclusive spaces, democratic movements, and others. There's a lot of funding, a lot of effort, and it's growing. And I did a presentation right now where I just showed the faces of 20 heads of state around the world. One of them is now not head of state anymore, Trump, but Modi, Duterte, Putin, Xi, Orban, Erdogan, Bolsonaro, many, many more. We're having this rise of right-wing, authoritarian, misogynist, and a lot of hate-based messages, incredible corruption. And then you're having other examples. You're having Jacinda Ardern, you're having the prime ministers of Finland and Iceland. We're having other images of leadership coming up. And we're having transnational movements like the growing climate change movement, which is one of the largest youth movements in history. So you have that happening. Exactly as you said, John, in terms of both Black Lives Matters, you could see the resonance of that across Europe and more widely as well. And when you mentioned GPAC, Meta, we just recently had an event bringing together activists from Hong Kong, Myanmar, and Colombia, sharing experiences and lessons and supporting each other. I think what's interesting is many youth around the world are becoming involved in movements, and they never heard about the Helsinki Citizens Assembly. They never heard about many of the legacies and movements which we would have grown up with or been part of in the past. But you're seeing new generations of people engaging, wanting to see positive change across a whole breadth of issues. But at the same time, we're having those systemic crises. We're having greater and greater concentration of wealth. We're having our state systems, which are not dealing with these issues well. And we really are seeing a rise, on the one hand, of right-wing extremist movements. We're seeing a rise of brazenness of repression. You can look at what's happening in China and Hong Kong. You can look at Myanmar, Colombia, many other contexts, Erdogan in Turkey. So when you said we're not winning before, I don't know if we're winning or not winning, but it really is a moment in which we need to bring the best of what we can, to grow these movements, to grow these struggles, to make these connections. And we've been involved in an initiative the last years in Europe called Do One Brave Thing, where we are engaging with youth in Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Italy. And we're working with them to look at what are the forms of hate that they're experiencing in their communities and the issues they're facing in their communities, and also linking them, connecting with what's happening more widely globally. But we're trying to encourage and inspire them to learn from different struggles and how they can engage in their context to stand up and to work for change. And I think movements and organizations are doing that in various ways all over the world. And that's part of the answer, that they're continually reaching out, engaging, connecting, linking, training together to find out how we address these challenges in our own countries and transnationally. And I'm sorry that I'm going to have to pop off in just a moment to.
Okay, that's a good contribution to the at least making me feel a little better. Phyllis, you already feel pretty good about it. You're more optimistic than I was. I have come to the conclusion that democracy is failing. And what are we going to do to save
I
democracy?
necessarily disagree with that. I think that it's, I absolutely agree with Kai that we are in a very, very dangerous moment. And much of it stems from the power of the US when we've been facing the possibility of a takeover by these right-wing forces. The insurrection of January 6th was a very real threat in a very immediate sense. And the rise of these right-wing authoritarians in so many countries all are rooted in their indigenous, that national particularity for sure. But the existence of a Trump administration for 4 years that, among other things, enabled somebody like Steve Bannon to run around the world organizing these right-wing conferences, establishing not just ties, but core organizing strategies across Europe, in parts of Latin America and elsewhere. This is a very dangerous reality because the US remains still the superpower militarily and strategically and economically. And it's a very dangerous moment. Having said that, I am more optimistic because I think that social movements are on the rise. They don't ever, I don't think, when they win, they don't ever systemically take one step and then another step, and everybody knows when we get to step 10, that will be our victory. It's like, whoa, did we just win? Wait, what? How did that happen? I think that's always the case. And I don't know when any of our movements are going to face a situation which we can characterize as a victory. It's been a while, but I think it will happen. I think it will happen. And I think that some of the aspects of the pandemic, which I agree have led to very dangerous social and economic developments, the consolidation of inequality caused by the pandemic across the world, both within states and between states, between the North and the South, and within both the South and the North. All of those things are very, very real. And we gained certain things, the normalization of having transnational meetings and discussions regularly because you can do it all without having to fly. I mean, I think all of us have spent way too much time on planes for our health and the health of the planet. And suddenly, I mean, I sort of hate it, as I'm sure we all do, sitting looking at these little boxes, but we've come to take it for granted. That is how we communicate. And that means that a lot of things are possible that might not have been in the past.
Yeah, and that's really what I want to say. I'm claiming as my special project. I want to introduce people who represent different networks of people who are organizing in a region or in some other sector, for example, cyber risks. I want to introduce the cyber risk people to the famine people, that kind of connectivity that needs to be made to remind people that we're all on the same team, even though we work in silos. And I want to sort of puncture those silos and introduce people like Kai to John and to Phyllis. And I think that is, I think it's a way to make some headway toward reminding us that we're really, really on the same team.
Meta, I want to say thank you for that. And thank you to John, to Phyllis, and to you, Meta, for your work for decades and continuing work. And to apologize that I do have to head off now, but I hope to be
Time for us.
Conversations continuing.
Time for us to end anyway. So you're not bringing the thing to a close. I would have to bring it to a close if you didn't. So I'm really glad. I'm so delighted that we've had this conversation. Let's stay in touch, shall we?
Thank you all. Thank you, Meta.
Bless you all. All right, onward. Take